On a quiet autumn morning, I arrived at Baker Street to find Sherlock Holmes deep in conversation with a stout, red-haired gentleman whose face carried an odd mixture of pride and distress. Holmes, with his usual briskness, pulled me into the room. "Watson, you could not have come at a better time. This case promises to be one of the most unusual we have ever encountered." Our visitor introduced himself as Jabez Wilson, a pawnbroker with a modest business near the city. Though his clothing was ordinary, his blazing red hair was so striking that it seemed almost theatrical. Yet there was nothing amusing about the furrow in his brow as he began his tale. Wilson explained that weeks earlier his assistant, a sharp fellow named Vincent Spaulding, had urged him to apply for a curious opportunity. Spaulding had shown him a newspaper advertisement announcing that the Red-Headed League was seeking new members. According to the notice, the League, funded by the estate of an eccentric American millionaire who admired red-haired men, offered a salary of £4 a week for performing nominal services. The only requirement was that applicants must be over 21 and blessed with vividly red hair. Wilson, whose fiery locks matched the description perfectly, was intrigued. Business had been slow, and an extra income would ease his worries. Encouraged by Spaulding, he went to the address listed in office on Pope's Court, Fleet Street, only to discover a sight both comical and astonishing. The narrow lane was jammed with hundreds of red-haired men of every shade imaginable, from dull auburn to blazing crimson. The crowd looked like a sea of copper and flame, each man jostling for his chance at this strange employment. Wilson nearly gave up then and there, but Spaulding urged him forward through the throng until they reached the office. Inside sat a small man with hair even redder than Wilson's. He introduced himself as Duncan Ross, a manager of the League. Ross examined Wilson's head with almost scientific fascination, tugging at his locks to ensure they were genuine. At last, satisfied, Ross declared him the ideal candidate. The duties, he explained, were simple. Wilson must attend the office every day from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. without fail, and spend those hours copying out entries from the Encyclopedia Britannica. He was to bring his own pens and ink. But the League would provide the table, chair, and the steady salary of £4 a week. The only strict condition was that he must never be absent during those hours. If he left even once, his position would be forfeit. Though puzzled, Wilson could see no harm in it. Spaulding eagerly offered to manage the pawnshop while his employer was away. So, the very next day, Wilson began his new routine. Each morning he copied page after page about abbots, archery, and architecture. Each afternoon Ross returned, dismissed him, and locked the office door. The work was dull, but the pay was good. And for 8 weeks Wilson dutifully filled stacks of paper. Ross's visits grew less frequent, and soon Wilson was left entirely alone to scribble in silence. Then, without warning, it ended. One morning Wilson arrived to find the office locked and deserted. A sign nailed to the door read simply, "The Red-Headed League is dissolved. October 9th, 1890. Confused and insulted." Wilson asked nearby tenants about Duncan Ross, but none had heard of him. The landlord said the office had been rented only temporarily by a man calling himself William Morris, who had already moved on. Following the address Wilson was given, he found nothing but a manufacturer of artificial kneecaps. Ross Morris, whoever he was, had vanished. Wilson, indignant at having wasted his time, came straight to Holmes, to him. The whole affair looked like a cruel joke, albeit an expensive one for the perpetrators. Who had paid him £30 for meaningless scribbling? But Holmes saw something deeper. He leaned back, fingertips pressed together, his eyes gleaming. Your case, Mr. Wilson, is far from trivial. It may conceal matters of far greater importance than you imagine. Holmes asked pointed questions about Wilson's assistant. How long had Spaulding worked for him? Just over a month. How was he hired through an advertisement, and at half wages? What was his appearance? A small, quick man of about 30, clean-shaven, with pierced ears and a splash of acid on his forehead. At this, Holmes's eyes narrowed. He asked whether business had been attended to during Wilson's absences. It had. Spaulding was still with him, working as usual. Holmes dismissed Wilson with the assurance that he would investigate. When the pawnbroker departed, I confessed to Holmes that the story baffled me completely. Holmes, however, was exhilarated. The more bizarre a case appears, Watson, the less mysterious it proves in the end. Commonplace crimes are far harder to solve, but here we have something refreshingly unusual. He lit his pipe and announced that this was a 3-pipe problem, requesting silence while he sank into thought. For nearly an hour he sat motionless, eyes closed, smoke curling around him like mist. Then, suddenly, he leapt to his feet. Come, Watson. We have an afternoon of observation ahead of us. There is more here than meets the eye. Holmes led me on a brisk walk through the bustling streets until we reached Coburg Square, where Jabez Wilson kept his pawn shop. The square was dingy and narrow, hemmed in by shabby brick houses. Above the shop door, a faded sign read, Jabez Wilson, pawnbroker. Holmes paused to study the building, tapping his cane against the pavement with a thoughtful rhythm. He circled the block slowly, his eyes darting to each storefront. Finally, he turned to me with a gleam in his eye. Note this. Watson adjoining Wilson's shop is the branch of the City and Suburban Bank. That, I think, tells us something. I opened my mouth to ask what, but Holmes waved me silent. He strode back to Wilson's door and knocked smartly. It was answered almost instantly by a young man with a bright, clean-shaven face. Holmes asked him for directions to the Strand, and the assistant replied swiftly and precisely before shutting the door. Holmes chuckled. Smart fellow. Too smart. Perhaps. Did you notice his knees? I had not. Wrinkled and stained. They tell me he has spent much time kneeling in dirt. For what purpose? Watson. Not photography, as Wilson believes. No, he has been burrowing underground. I think we are on the verge of something important. Without further explanation, Holmes whisked me away. Now, some music. I need to think. He took me to a concert at St. James's Hall, where he sat enraptured, fingers conducting invisible orchestras, his mind both far away and intensely present. I could not reconcile this dreamy figure with the keen-eyed hunter I had seen outside the pawn shop. Yet when the final notes faded, he rose with sudden energy. Tonight, Watson, we act. A serious crime is afoot, and I intend to stop it. Be at Baker Street by 10 o'clock, revolver in pocket. There may be danger. With that, he vanished into the crowd, leaving me with more questions than answers. Later that night I arrived at Baker Street to find Holmes in company with 2 other men. One I recognized as Inspector Peter Jones of Scotland Yard. A solid bulldog of a fellow, brave, if not brilliant. The other was introduced as Mr. Merriweather, a bank director whose long face and shiny hat gave him a mournful air. Our party is complete, Holmes declared, fastening his heavy coat. Gentlemen, Tonight we hunt one of London's most formidable criminals. His name is John Clay Murderer, thief, forger, and one of the cleverest men at work today. I have crossed paths with him before, but never laid hands on him. Tonight, we may change that. Mr. Merriweather here is personally interested, for Clay's target is the vaults of his bank. Clay, exclaimed Jones, eyes alight. I've chased him for years and never seen his face. If you can deliver him, Holmes, Scotland Yard will be in your debt. Holmes merely smiled. Then let us be on our way. We drove in 2 cabs through a maze of gas-lit streets until we stopped near the bank that stood back to back with Wilson's pawn shop. Merriweather unlocked a narrow side door and led us down a winding stair of cold stone. We passed through heavy iron gates into a cavernous cellar stacked with crates and boxes. The air smelled of damp earth and metal. Holmes lifted his lantern. We are now beneath the city and suburban bank, he explained quietly. Within these crates lies a fortune in French gold, 30,000 Napoleons borrowed from the Bank of France. That, gentlemen, is what our adversaries are tunneling toward. Merriweather rapped the stone floor with his cane, and it gave a hollow echo. Good heavens, he muttered. They could be directly beneath us even now. Holmes frowned. Please, sir? No noise. You may give us away. He then crouched with magnifying glass in hand, inspecting the cracks between the flagstones. After a moment he rose, satisfied. Yes, the work has progressed this far. They will come tonight. We doused the lantern and arranged ourselves in silence behind the crates. I crouched with my revolver ready, nerves tingling. Total darkness enveloped us. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I could hear Jones's heavy breathing and the faint rustle of Merriweather shifting uncomfortably. Holmes remained perfectly still. At last it came a faint spark of light on the floor. It widened into a yellow slit. Then a square hole as a stone was pushed aside. A white, delicate hand groped upward, followed by the keen face of a young man. He pulled himself through with agile strength, then reached down to haul up a companion slider with a shock of vivid red hair. "All clear?" the first whispered. "Hand me the bags." "Not so fast," came Holmes's voice, sharp as a whip. He leapt from hiding, seizing the intruder by the collar. The red-haired accomplice dived back into the tunnel, but Jones lunged and caught at his coat. A pistol glinted in the young man's hand, yet Holmes struck it aside with his hunting crop, sending it clattering to the stones. "It is no use. John Clay," Holmes said calmly. "The game is finished." Clay straightened, remarkably composed even with Jones clapping irons on his wrists. "So it seems. I must congratulate you, Mr. Holmes. Your methods are thorough. I suppose my companion has already been taken at the other end." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "There are officers waiting at the pawn-shop door." Clay bowed slightly, almost courtly. "Then I am your prisoner. But allow me one courtesy when you address me. Remember, I am of royal blood. A little respect, if you please." Jones snorted. "You'll have all the respect the law provides, and no more. March." And so, under the flickering lantern light of the bank vault, one of the most audacious robberies ever attempted in London came to its end. We emerged from the cold vault into the night air, the captured John Clay walking with a peculiar dignity between Inspector Jones and Mr. Merriweather. Outside, a waiting cab clattered on the stones to carry him away to the station, while the rest of us stood beneath the gaslight, taking in the enormity of what had just been prevented. "Really, Mr. Holmes," Merriweather said. His long face now brightened with relief. "The bank owes you more than it can ever repay, without your foresight. We should have awakened tomorrow to find 30,000 gold coins spirited away. Holmes waved the praise aside. I ask nothing but reimbursement for my small expenses. Beyond that, the satisfaction of unraveling such a unique scheme is reward enough. His thin lips curled in a half-smile. And, of course, to have finally laid hands on John Clay is no small pleasure. We returned to Baker Street, where, in the quiet of his sitting room, Holmes poured us each a glass of whiskey and soda. The clock ticked toward dawn as he leaned back, eyes half closed, explaining the chain of reasoning that had brought us here. It was clear from the outset, Watson, that the League was merely a pretext. The only purpose of such a bizarre invention was to lure Mr. Wilson from his shop for several hours each day. £4 a week is a large sum to pay a man for copying encyclopedias, yet what is that against the fortune they intended to seize? The moment I learned Wilson had an assistant willing to work at half wages, I knew there was a strong motive behind it. A clever rogue does not squander his talents without cause. I listened with rapt attention, trying to follow each link in the chain. But how did you know the assistant's motive was tunneling? I asked. Elementary, my dear Watson. Consider the facts. The man's knees were wrinkled and stained, suggesting long hours spent crouched on the ground. His supposed interest in photography and trips to the cellar were an obvious cover. What could occupy a man for so many hours below ground, save for excavation? When I rapped upon the pavement with my cane, I confirmed the direction of the cellar. It did not extend toward the street, but toward the rear, where the bank lay. The conclusion was inevitable. They were tunneling for the vault. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a hunter who has sprung his trap. The Red-Headed League was ingenious. It offered Wilson money and flattered his vanity. Meanwhile, Clay and his partner worked day after day, knowing their employer would be safely occupied with his quills and foolscap once their tunnel was complete. They dissolved the League and prepared to strike. But they forgot one thing in creating such a strange ruse. They created precisely the kind of puzzle that interests me most. I could not suppress a laugh, and to think poor Wilson believed it all a cruel prank. Holmes chuckled. For him, it was a fortunate adventure. He gained £30 for his trouble and a curious story to tell. No, the true losers tonight are the criminals, and perhaps Inspector Jones, who would never have caught them without us. At that moment, as if conjured by the remark, Jones himself bustled in, flushed with triumph. "We've got the other fellow," he announced. Caught him as he tried to slink out of the pawn-shop door. Between the two of them. They'll be safe behind bars for quite some time. I'll not forget your help, Mr. Holmes. Holmes inclined his head politely. "I am glad to be of service. But let us be clear, it was your brave officers who closed the net. I merely pointed out where to cast it when Jones had gone." The room fell quiet, save for the crackle of the fire. Holmes sat gazing into the flames, his profile sharp against the glow. At last he spoke, his tone softer, almost reflective. "You see, Watson, life itself furnishes the most extraordinary combinations, far stranger than anything the imagination could contrive. A millionaire who leaves his fortune to benefit red-haired men, a shopkeeper lured into endless drudgery, a tunnel dug beneath London streets, all converging on one moment in the dark vault of a bank. Strange, yet perfectly logical. I thought of Jabez Wilson, sitting bewildered in his little shop, unaware of the drama that had unfolded beneath his very floorboards. To him, the affair was a nuisance. To us, it had been a brush with one of the keenest criminal minds in the city. The contrast struck me sharply. Holmes rose and stretched, fatigue finally stealing over him. "Well, Watson, the chase is done. But remember this whenever you encounter the bizarre. Do not dismiss it, for often. The more outlandish a case appears, the more straightforward its explanation will prove." With that, he extinguished his pipe, and the great detective at last allowed himself to rest, leaving me to marvel once again at the strange, unfailing power of his reason. The following morning, London bustled on as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, yet I could not shake the image of that dark vault, the sudden glow of lantern light, and the pale hand reaching up through the floor. Holmes, however, treated the affair as little more than a stimulating diversion. As he sat at breakfast, casually spreading marmalade on his toast, he seemed already to have turned his thoughts to other problems. "Holmes," I said, still full of curiosity, "you reasoned out every step so beautifully. But tell me, how could you be certain they would make their attempt on that particular night?" He smiled faintly. "Think it through, Watson. The League office had been abruptly dissolved, meaning the tunnel was complete and Wilson's absence no longer necessary, once finished. Such a passage could not remain undiscovered indefinitely. Dust might betray it. The landlord might grow suspicious, or Wilson himself might wander below. The criminals would need to act quickly. Saturday night offered them the best chance, for it allowed 2 full days before banking resumed on Monday, with every factor considered. The conclusion was plain: they would come then or not at all. I nodded, impressed once again at how his logic seemed to peel away every veil. "And so you summoned Jones and Merryweather." "Exactly. Jones may lack imagination, but he is brave, and his men are dependable. Merryweather had the authority to admit us to the vault. And you. My dear Watson, your revolver is always a steadying comfort." I confess I felt a surge of pride at his words, for often I thought myself no more than a chronicler of his exploits, a bystander to his genius. Yet in that long hour of silence underground, my heart pounding, I had realized how much I valued the trust he placed in me. Later that day, we received a brief note of thanks from Jabez Wilson, written in his large, clumsy hand. It expressed both relief and lingering bewilderment. He declared he had never dreamed his humble pawn-shop could be connected with such daring villainy, and though disappointed to lose his easy employment, he was grateful to know the truth. Holmes read the note aloud with a wry smile. Our stout friend will dine out on this story for years. Imagine his relish in telling customers how he once played a part in foiling London's cleverest thief. For myself, I reflected on how swiftly ordinary lives could brush against the hidden undercurrents of crime. Wilson had merely answered a peculiar advertisement, yet behind it lay a conspiracy that threatened one of the city's great banks. It reminded me that beneath the veneer of everyday commerce and routine, darker designs were always at work, waiting only for a mind like Holmes's to expose them. That evening, as twilight settled over Baker Street, Holmes sat again in his chair, pipe in hand, gazing thoughtfully through the smoke. His expression was not one of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction, the look of a craftsman pleased with the execution of his art. "You know, Watson," he said at last, "men like John Clay are formidable, not because they are brutish, but because they are educated, subtle, and daring. He might have been a statesman or a scholar, but he chose crime. It is always the waste of talent that I find most melancholy. Yet perhaps it is well, for without such adversaries, life would be insufferably dull. I considered his words to me. The case had been an adventure tinged with peril to Holmes. It was a puzzle, a chance to stretch his powers, and a reminder that his existence was dedicated not to wealth or fame, but to the pursuit of clarity in a world of shadows. And so ended the curious affair of the Red-Headed League, a story that began with laughter at a ridiculous advertisement and concluded with handcuffs clicking around the wrists of a master criminal. It was, as Holmes observed, proof that truth is often stranger than invention, and that the most bizarre appearances may cloak the simplest of designs. If this tale has intrigued you, I invite you to reflect on its lesson that vigilance and logic can unravel even the most bewildering mysteries, and that beneath the ordinary lies the extraordinary, waiting to be discovered. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear what you make of Holmes's deductions and whether you saw the ending coming. Join us again for more classic mysteries, retold for modern ears.